What does this even do? What is some Russian kid who wants to play Cyberpunk gonna do?
Some YouTubers like TheQuartering keep insisting that sanctions against Russia is just virtue signaling by woke companies.
I just think of the citizens, the innocent, civilians on both sides who don't want this.
First off, concerns regarding punishing ordinary Russian citizens and causing them hardship is a valid one. Ordinary citizens are, sadly, the acceptable casualties of economic warfare. Historically, we've also seen that economic sanctions tend to take a long time to work. Although in the case of Russia, this may very well depend on how much of their resources were depleted by the global pandemic. Another valid concern is that sanctions may make Russia even more unwilling to negotiate. That is a really, really difficult balance to strike. When in an adversarial position, any action you take, no matter how much you are in the right, can escalate tensions. Let's say, for example, someone who's experiencing domestic violence reports it to the police, leaves, or both. That's actually the most dangerous time for that person. Ultimately, aggravating your aggressor needs to be weighed against taking measures to stop the aggression. So when do you go? When the first bottle gets thrown near you? When someone shoots a paintball gun to scare you? When someone brandishes a firearm? When they actually hit you? When they issue a formal declaration of war? When they bomb your village? There's no real right answer in a single domestic situation, and the variety of interests can make it even more complicated in an international context. If you do it too soon, you're overreacting. If you do it too late, you're lying, because who would ever tolerate letting it get that far? Here the United States waited for a formal declaration of war to make requests of private companies to suspend services. A very mild response, all things considered, if Putin's is indeed an illegal war as it appears to be. The implications of the global community allowing an illegal war is a topic all on its own. Suffice to say the implications are scary and far-reaching. But for all the valid considerations, let's not pretend that economic sanctions do not have any effect more profound than, insert name here, Hollywood actor's opinion. So why are Russian cats being banned from competing in international competitions? Why is FIFA excluding Russia from participating? Why are Visa and MasterCard withdrawing from the country? Why are Netflix and TikTok no longer willing to operate there? It's clear that Jeremy and others in his camp do not understand the very, very basic principles of economics, never mind the more complex nuances of secondary economic chain reactions. If you mess with a country's balance of payments, simply put, their import to export ratio, you can manipulate their currency, even tank it completely. When you tank a currency, you make borrowing money, something that pretty much every modern day country does to balance their budget, more difficult and or expensive, as the strength of a country's currency impacts its ability to repay, and thus its credit worthiness. Basically, by no longer importing Russian goods, which are not essential to their own country's internal functioning, that is to say, oil and oil related products. Since the bulk, let's say approximately 60% of Russia's exports, consists of oil and oil related products, while it may seem petty, the banning of Russian cats from being registered internationally makes a tiny contribution towards reducing the other approximately 40% of Russian exports, without creating an international bidding war for non-Russian oil, thus avoiding pushing up global fuel prices even more, at least as far as possible in the current circumstances. When the world market devalues a country's currency so significantly as has happened with Russia in the last couple of weeks, that also has knock-on effects on the sanctioned country's internal economy, including skyrocketing lending rates, something we've also observed in Russia, incidentally. Normally, high interest rates would mean lower inflation, but in the case of severe economic sanctions, both may be present as stagflation sets in. This combination of decreased external and internal purchasing power via a devalued currency and increased inflation respectively, as well as increased finance costs, may drive up the cost of war significantly for Russia. As the adage from Napoleon goes, an army marches on its stomach. Companies that export to Russia, that is to say, Russia is the importer of these goods, may also contribute by effectively cutting off retail sales outlets or other partners who are entitled to some sort of commission or who make some sort of profit off these sales, impacting Russia's gross domestic product per capita, a key indicator of economic health. Incidentally, this is also a containment strategy for the United States and for European nations, as war tends to get more complex and more expensive on the more fronts you fight it, so it may make it less likely that Russia will escalate tensions between itself and other neighbors like NATO member Poland. TikTok, although a Chinese entity, may be genuinely concerned about the potential exposure new pro-Russian propaganda legislation may have on their company, their employees and their creators, should they continue to operate there. War may very well also make it less profitable for private companies like Netflix and Epic Games to operate there. In general, prices are set in the local currency and the exchange rate profit or losses are borne by the company or hedged for on the financial markets, something that will likely become more difficult and or expensive. There may also be concerns regarding the safety of private company infrastructure, assets and people inside a country engaged in war. Commandeering and or seizure of infrastructure is not outside of the realm of possibility. Adult entertainment companies like a certain hub may, in addition to all of this, also have very real concerns that economic hardship could lead to an increase in trafficking, which in itself is horrible, but which could also get them into legal trouble, of both the criminal and civil varieties, and which could do them a great deal of reputational harm. Visa and MasterCard may have reporting obligations when it comes to anti-money laundering and other prevention initiatives, and they may see their compliance costs skyrocketing in a country at war, a situation where criminal elements tend to thrive. After WW2, globalization has been seen by many as a way to avoid another world war. Supply lines are global, and economic sanctions may make it more difficult and or expensive to obtain domestic resources that serve as input for local production. This may impact goods essential to the war effort, other strategic national interests, and basic foodstuffs. While this may be unlikely in the case of Russia at this time, sustained hard economic sanctions may cause internal destabilization that could lead to regime change in the sanctioned country in the long term. So let's recap. Sanctions 1 can devalue a country's currency by reducing the demand for it. 2 can make borrowing more difficult and or more expensive. 3 can drive up the cost of war by reducing purchasing power and increasing finance costs. 4 can increase lending rates, cooling economic growth and making doing business more difficult and or more expensive, making a country generally less competitive. 5 can disrupt global supply lines, making internal production more difficult and or expensive. 6 can help contain war to a smaller region. 7 in some cases cause internal discontent and unrest, making regime change more likely. Now, frankly, you'd think, considering the size of the TheQuartering's channel, that he would be able to find a guest to explain these very basic concepts to him, in terms that even he is able to understand, rather than appeals for people to leave comments that he probably won't even read. The fact that he still continues to pump out videos claiming that the only conceivable explanation for companies pulling out of Russia is virtue signaling seems to indicate that either he already knows that this is not true and just wants to benefit from the traffic this hot take brings, or that he simply does not care enough about truth and integrity in reporting to do the most basic research imaginable.